This is the Comics Alternative, episode 280. Reviews of The New World, Young Frances, and A Walk Through Hell, number 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week we're going to be looking at 3 recent releases, and these are quite different books, one from the other. As many times they are on our review shows, we try to do that. We're going to begin with Chris Reynolds' The New World, Comics from Mauretania. After that, we're going to look at Hartley Lin's Young Frances. And then we're going to wrap up with A Walk Through Hell, number 1, written by Garth Ennis with art by Goran Sudzuka. But before we get into those reviews, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
Yeah, some of the great discounts that you can get at Discount Comic Book Service come via the bundles that they offer. And every month you're going to find lots of fantastic bundles where you can get savings of 45, 50% off a huge bundle of comics. For instance, this month, in the month of May, there's DC bundles that cover the DC Young Animal line, the new miniseries that are coming out from DC, a DC Kids bundle. You're also going to find Marvel Fresh Legacy and Fresh Start bundles as well. And you're also going to find Valiant bundles, all kinds of great discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. You can also find the new printing of Young Frances that we're talking about today, which is already sold out of its first printing, but you can find that it's relisted for its new printing at Discount Comic Book Service at a 30% discount for $13.97, so that's a pretty good deal.
It is, but you know, it doesn't surprise me because you can find great deals every single month at Discount Comic Book Service. Well, I mean, why not? Discount is in their name. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yeah, we'd so appreciate that.
Well, Paul, before we get into this week's discussion, we should share with our listeners some correspondence that we received about last week's episode.
Always excited to hear from you, so let's dig into the mailbag.
Mail time. Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
Yes, and this is from someone who is a part of our Slack community. He is Perseus on Slack. His real name is Don Fenner. And he and I talk every now and again about what we're reading. We recommend titles to each other. And, of course, he follows the podcast. And he had told me earlier this week that he began listening to our preview show and that he would have to keep coming back to it because he couldn't listen to it all in one setting. If listeners recall, last week's episode where we looked at the May previews catalog was not quite 3 hours long. And both Paul and I shouted out to listeners to let us know what they thought about the length of the show. You know, are you annoyed that these preview shows tend to go long? Do you really like that? And Don actually responded this morning as we're recording this to that question that we posed. And he writes, "Still listening to the previews episode. It's so good. Never think of shortening them. They are way too informative and awesome."
Oh, Don, thank you so much. That's super affirming. It makes us excited to do this work, to hear that. And I know that I always enjoy the long conversations that, Derek, you have with our other co-hosts when you do previews. So that's great to hear. It does occur to me, though, that we asked that question at around the 2-hour mark. So if there are others who didn't make it that far and you have feedback for us, we do welcome it. But Don, my heart is warmed by your feedback. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Don. And the thing is, as you and I right now, Paul, are recording this week's episode, it's only been not quite 3 days, maybe 3 days since we released the May preview show. So I hope that others will have the opportunity to respond to us and let us know what they think about the preview shows, its length, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. It's a labor of love for us. So, it's very easy for it to leak into the second and third hours. But, we do it for the joy of the work and hope you enjoy it and hope you benefit from it as well.
That's right. Sometimes leaking is good. Paul, let's start with the first book that we're going to be looking at this week, and this is The New World, Comics from Mauretania, and this is by Chris Reynolds, and it is released from New York Review Comics. Now, the pub date, according to Amazon, and I guess this is when it goes out in the bookstores, was May 1st, but it may have come out in comic shops before then.
Yeah, it's been out for a little bit now, but, New York Review Comics, since its inception, was it the beginning of last year around, or maybe 2 years ago, has just reliably given us really book after book of, for me, a lot of creators and titles that I would never have known about except for their really smart curation. So this is some really interesting comics that we're looking at today.
Yes, definitely so. And the thing about New York Review Comics, they've been around for at least a couple of years. I remember that. Or about 2 years, let's say. And I remember when they first started releasing titles, when they announced this new publisher. And it was around the time that Edward and I began doing our monthly Euro comic shows. And this was perfect for us. We have discussed on the Euro Comic series quite a number of New York Review Comics releases in the past. And that's because most of what they publish are books in translation, and rather innovative books in translation. This is one of those few titles that had originally come out in English. Now, Chris Reynolds is from the UK, correct?
Yeah, Welsh origin, but in the UK.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. And so this would be something that we wouldn't discuss on the Euro Comics series, but I think this is the very first occasion that we've discussed a New York Review Comics release on our regular review show.
Yeah, definitely. And we can probably mention now that part of the reason that we're holding this in our hands is very much the curation work of Seth. Seth, who, of course, you interviewed earlier this year on the podcast, Seth, well-known cartoonist. But Seth's advocacy for Chris Reynolds' work and sort of the high praise he's heaped on him in the past, particularly for the U.S. audience, has kept him in the conversation, I think, and made it so that this book, which Seth took, a part in designing, you can see Seth's design work, which is also, it was very characteristic. Gracing this volume. So it's a good looking book, a hefty book to hold. But, I recognize that, we do have in many ways Seth to thank for, this being in our hands and being able to see Chris Reynolds' work.
Yeah. Now, Seth does the design. He also has a designer's note at the very end of the book, which I wanted to discuss at some point.
Sure. Yeah.
And the foreword is written by Ed Park, who is a founding editor of The Believer, and he's the former editor of the Voice Literary Supplement. So I think both Ed Park and especially Seth's notes in the back, so their contributions in many ways set a context for this book, which is useful because I was not familiar with Chris Reynolds' work before this. Now, Seth mentions in his note that he wrote an appreciation of Reynolds comics for the Comics Journal back in 2005. And then since then, he comments that people kind of come to him as an authority on Chris Reynolds or as someone who is able to appreciate him. And so I think that's how he came to, or partly how he came to being asked to design this book. Now, let me ask, did you know about Chris Reynolds' work before this release, The New World?
I hadn't. And I think that this was another example when something comes from, New York Review Comics. Sorry. I'm often sent, scrambling to the Wikipedia to find out what this creator's lineage is and so on. And, so I hadn't known, Chris Reynolds' work. Had you?
I had not either. And I like you, I went to look up who Chris Reynolds was. Now, there's not an entry for Chris Reynolds on Wikipedia. There is one, though, for Mauretania Comics that apparently Chris and UK artist, musician Paul Harvey they worked on together. But that entry on Wikipedia is not extensive at all, maybe a couple of sentences. So that really didn't tell me much of anything. Yeah. And I haven't gone back to try to find that piece that Seth wrote for the Comics Journal in 2005. I guess I should have. But I did discover that back in 1990, Penguin Books published a graphic novel, Mauretania, A Mystery and a Love Story. And from what I gather, that graphic novel is, in essence, the last piece in this book, The New World, which takes up about half of the text, which is titled Mauretania.
Yeah, it is the last half. So it begins with a longer short story of about 40 some odd pages called The Dial, then a series of short stories of various lengths, and then Mauretania. And one of the things I was conscious of as I was reading is, there's no indication in this, in the text itself of the dates of these short stories. Reynolds' work, I think, released, in various schedules. And the arrangement of them seemed purposeful. And I think that beyond designing the work, Seth also had a hand in deciding the ordering of the work, which seems not necessarily chronological, but rather does have to me a certain logic in it. So I keep thinking as I'm reading that I'm being led through this, actually quite challenging text and quite abstruse world by Seth with some amount of intention in the ordering of what we're exposed to and when.
Right. I did see that Reynolds began creating these Mauretania comics back in 1985. So this is a work long in coming. I just find it interesting that I hadn't even heard of Chris Reynolds. And I think that probably says more about my lack of awareness and inquisitiveness than it does anything. But at the same time, and this is something that Seth points out in the note that he has in the back, he does feel, even still, that Reynolds doesn't get the kind of attention that he deserves, which does suggest that Reynolds is one of these cartoonists that really does fly under the radar, even of people who are in the know when it comes to comics such as this.
Yeah. I mean, and there's interesting interaction between metatext and text for me, because as I read, there's a lot in this work that is really about staring at places and objects, and staring at those places and objects sort of over the shoulder, which we see a lot of shoulders in this text, staring over the shoulders of certain characters. And I am, interpreting layers of understanding that involve the shoulders of those characters, and also Chris Reynolds himself. And then also, I kind of feel like Seth is taking us on this journey. I can't help but have my associations with Seth and his previous work color my reading of Chris Reynolds, because his appreciation is so, Seth's appreciation is so, instrumental in sort of this book being in our hands. So I almost feel like, there's a certain legitimacy or credence that's being lent here. And I'm sort of, by my trust in Seth is bringing me to this work. And maybe that's unfair to Mr. Reynolds and unfair to the work, but I can't help that is my sort of history and my experience, my exposure to the text. So that became sort of an interesting other angle through which to look at this, I think this text, which lends itself to all kinds of interpretation. Put it that way.
Yes, I feel the same. And I'll be honest, when I saw this book first solicited, and I can't remember if it was late last year or early this year, but I didn't recognize the name Chris Reynolds. I didn't know these comics, but one of the things that did draw me was the fact that Seth was designing this. And so that association made me want to check out this book and to possibly discuss it for the podcast. Yeah. Then I got a hold of it and said, "Oh, definitely we have to look at this."
Yeah.
And I can see to some degree maybe an aesthetic kinship between what we see in Chris Reynolds' work and what we see of Seth.
Yes.
The difference between the two is that Seth is not near as enigmatic as Chris Reynolds is in his various comics. But that's fine. And that's, I think that's one of the things that at first can be a little confusing when you pick up this book and especially if you're not familiar with Chris Reynolds, like I was, and you come to the New World, this new collection.
Yeah.
And you start reading the stories and you get to, and you're right. The first one begins with, I don't know if you want to call it a novella or a long short story called The Dial.
Yeah.
And it is strange, but it's strange and enigmatic in a way that really draws you in.
Yes.
And with a lot of these stories, I have to tell you, I was scratching my head throughout most of my reading experience, but I loved it nonetheless. And there's something about the enigma, about the ambiguity, the fact that the mystery, I think, and I want to underscore the word mystery, that makes this book, as confusing as it can be at times, so compelling.
That's right.
But it's supposed to be enigmatic. I mean, there's supposed to be these mysteries here. And in fact, I was looking on Amazon, checking out, again, this original publication of Mauretania from Penguin.
Yes.
And in the description, under the biography, they mentioned that Reynolds describes some of the things that he does as fun but spooky detective strips. And to a large degree, I think that does define many of the narratives that we have in the New World.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. One final word about Seth, because I don't mean to obsess over that dimension of it, which is obviously still a small part of it. But, the cover flap is a similar design to the, a similar Seth style to like his works, like it's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, but also, that I'm a collector of Fantagraphics complete, Peanuts, and that design exists here. And it strikes me that Peanuts and the New World are opposites. But somewhere in the combination of the two lies Seth. And so there is a side to Seth's work that has this lingering and discomforting mystery sometimes, these hints of searching, this sense of emptiness, or sometimes ennui, or sometimes obsessiveness that is a note that is in his work that I feel like Chris Reynolds really knows how to create and force. This was a book that it's almost 250, 300 pages. I was so absorbed with every one of these really inscrutable stories. And yet I needed to pause frequently because I was just so locked into, to his world and to his way of sort of drawing you in, visually, like in a way that uniquely comics can. I was just so drawn into it, but I needed to take these breaks because that mood was so deep for me. It sort of, unsettled me so much that, I was like, let me read Young Frances for a little bit and then come back to this. And so I don't know if you experienced that as well, but it's a heavy text. It's interesting.
It is. And, you say that you didn't want to focus on Seth. I want to say one more thing about Seth's note, and then we can get into a deeper discussion of the narratives proper.
Yep.
There's a brief paragraph in his note that I think really does sum up my experience of reading Chris Reynolds. And he says, the main reason these comics are so vital is that there is a mystery at the center of them, a mystery that, thank God, is never solved. Reynolds' world is odd and disjointed. Some details connect, some don't. Nothing is spelled out for you, and as you read along, rather than clearing up, the waters actually get muddier. Oh, sure, some big points connect, and there are a few aha moments where you come to glimpse a hint of what is going on beneath the surface, but for the most part, the mystery of Mauretania remains mysterious. And then he goes on to describe this experience as a comfortable fogginess. And that phrase, a comfortable fogginess, does really sum up, at least my experience in reading this. Again, it's enigmatic, it's foggy, but there's something so drawing and compelling about these narratives.
Yep. Yeah. Some of it is in its setting, and we've avoided until now describing the actual stories because I think they resist description. You could say that there are sci-fi elements, but mostly it's not recognizable sci-fi. There's the presence of aliens, but they are like polite aliens in the background.
They're friendly aliens. They're
exactly.
Yeah. Aliens that let Earthlings be Earthlings.
That's right. And then there is sort of a main character-ish, or maybe two, called the Monitor, who wears a helmet everywhere.
Well, there's not that definite article. It's Monitor, not the Monitor.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's all right. That's right. That would be in reference to a Marvel Comics character or a DC character, I think. But indeed, like these characters, you spend a lot of time with them, and yet you still walk away knowing less about them than when you judge them initially. So it's full of mysteries. And, I guess I would describe it in a similar way that Seth does in terms of the elusiveness and yet the allure of that sort of mysterious element. When I read The Dial, I was reminded of this recurring dream that I've had, and I've come to discover many people have, of exploring a house. That dream where you're in a house and it's familiar to you, and yet it's not a house that you've ever really been in, Right. And I think there's like a Jungian notion of it, of that kind of house in your dream representing your psyche or whatever. But it seemed like this exploration of the anxieties around that house, the sort of exploration of its crevices and corners, and just finding yourself both like deeply familiar and haunted by this familiarity, and yet also everything seems like askew, or like what's wrong with this place. And it just was so so reminiscent of those dreams that I've had, that I just felt both entranced and also very uncomfortable.
I'm glad that you mentioned the dreamlike qualities of these stories, because in almost every single one of these comics narratives, and some are longer than others, right? We mentioned that The Dial is a longish work, and then the last half of this text is taken up by, I guess, what you could call a graphic novel, Mauretania. But then in between The Dial and Mauretania, we have a variety of, it's called short stories. Some of them are more narrative-like, such as a story, but others, I would argue, are much more poetic. Yeah. Whether they be 1 or 2 pages, sometimes 3, they have more of a feel of comics poetry than they do of comic storytelling.
Yes.
But we have, again, various pieces of different lengths and different tones. But one of the things that I think all of the contributions in this collection have in common is this dreamlike quality. And what happens in the story, the actual events, like a character going someplace or trying to make sense of something or meeting individuals, many times there is a lack of cause and effect linkage, very much like a dream. So you have a character doing something, and then all of a sudden the character is doing something else, or talking to someone, or is in a particular place, and you're wondering as the reader, well, how the hell did this character get there? Again, if you are trying to solve the mystery, if you're trying to put the pieces together in a way that makes rational sense, then I think you're not really taking these stories on their own terms, because they are very much like being in a dream. Right.
Yeah, and I think the visual element contributes to that a lot. So I mean, it's very visually distinctive right from the get-go. There are, it's sort of populated by really thick-lined art.
Thick-lined, heavy blacks, yes.
That's right. It's heavy black and white. As Ed Park in the forward writes, it seems like it's black and white and black, which is an apt description. The panel borders are super thick, and it seems almost drawn with a thick Sharpie, although there's places where, there's thin line work doing cross hatching and things like that. But the sort of thickness of the line contributes to that feeling that everything is not just encased in shadow, but really it's almost as if you can't distinguish minute features. And that includes in people's faces and expressions, but it includes in scenery and all that kind of stuff. And so there's this way that it borders on everything being super iconic, almost as if it's, drawn with a really thick marker and has to be very, iconic rather than detailed. And yet, in other places, I think certainly detail gives away a lot of, intention. But that I just found myself as I was looking at these thick black lines and all these heavy shadow cast scenes, just really, sort of almost quaking with this moody psychological effect, and I think that really impactful, great, sort of a perfect style for the weirdness of his stories.
Exactly. And there is something about the style, the heavy blacks, the thick lines that adds almost a shadowy sense to the art, which I think feeds into our previous description, at least to some degree, of these stories as mysteries, right? Definitely enigmas. And so I would even say that if they are mysteries or detective-like stories, that the style, the heavy black, thick line style adds to a way of reading this almost as a kind of noir.
Yeah.
Right. In that.
Very literal.
Yes.
noir,
yeah.
Right.
I mean, in that we can't ferret out what's going on, that there is something undiscernible going on below the surface of our awareness. And I think that adds to the enigma of many of these stories. I mean, noir by its very nature is made up of unanswerable questions. I mean, a classic example of that is, the Maltese Falcon, right? What does Sam Spade say at the very end? It's the things that dreams are made of. Right. Now, on the surface, that seems to make sense. But when you really think about it, especially within the context of that narrative, it doesn't. It doesn't answer any questions. But that's the way it's supposed to be.
That's right.
So, and I feel the same way about Reynolds' story here in The New World. Very compelling. And again, you're not going to understand much of what's going on, but I think that that's part of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, the thick line, the place where it sort of gives way quite often, is, I don't know if you noticed this or it gave you any feelings, but just a lot of exploration of places, especially buildings, right? There's entire pages that are consumed with characters. And I think this is another feature that goes along with this. We rarely, far more rarely than in other comics do we see faces. Often they're either enshrouded in darkness, or they are, their back is turned to us, which is
silhouettes.
Like, that's right. Or silhouettes, almost cardinal rules of comics drawing where those faces are supposed to, help us to connect and help to order our reactions are obscured from us. And instead we often see places, they're characters in places, but we really see their point of view as whether it's in the outdoors in the countryside with buses going by, or quite often just, again, an exploration of the doors, windows, corners, furniture in a room. And a lot of that stuff, that setting is very carefully rendered in contrast to the thickness of the line. And I feel like there's a lot of intention there in this, again, this way that like in a dreamlike fashion, you're sort of carried along place to place, trying to make sense of the world, be it an old world or a new world or whatever the heck it is, these settings that you're in. And there's something very, very confining about that. And yet you can't see, it's not like you're locked into one place. You're kind of searching and searching and searching through this maze until you can try to figure out or ascertain a sense of yourself.
Right. And I'm glad that you mentioned that many of the pieces in this book deal with buildings and the exploration of space.
Yeah.
The very first piece, the dial, this, if we want to call it a comics novella, that opens the collection is all about space and even home. Our main character, his name is Reg, correct?
Yes, in this story.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he is coming back from someplace, and at first we're not entirely sure where he's coming back from. But then later we learn that he had been in the military for a while. He's coming home, and his house is empty, and he gets there, and it seems to be fine. And then the next day he goes outside and discovers that there are people who are mining around his house.
Right.
And then he learns from one of the people overseeing the mining that there's something wrong with his house, that they're going to need to tear it down, but it's okay because it's falling apart anyhow, which is something that he didn't even notice when he first got home. Yeah. And then he goes back and he does realize, this place is falling apart. But then he thinks, okay, well, I can redo things. I can, fix it up to where it's back to where it was.
Right.
But after a while, he realizes that it's a lost cause. And then the home I think it's not even there anymore. And so, it kind of dreamlike. It's, again, a kind of dreamlike logic.
Yes.
Which is a lack of logic, right? Because we don't see the house break down. It's one way in one part of the story. It's another way in another part. And yet in a third part, it's completely different. So again, it doesn't really make sense what's going on with Reg and his house.
Right.
But that's okay because, again, trying to figure out the mystery both, I think, draws you along the narrative, has you wanting to read more, but at the same time can be a little frustrating, but a good kind of frustration.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask you that, whether how much joy, how much pleasure you derived out of reading this, and how maybe there's these intentional plans to frustrate any sort of deriving simple joy from reading this. But I think that it's so smart to start with that dial narrative, because I do think that encapsulates the mood, the tone so well. And I think it was a really smart thing that, you read that and throughout they keep referencing AUs in this little short story. And you're like, what are AUs? And this fool right here even went on the internet like, okay, AUs, what does AU stand for? Maybe it's a UK thing I don't know anything about, And then you read through the whole story. And then actually, maybe this gives a little bit away, but I don't think it's anything too bad. On the last page of the short story, there's a page of notes where everything is explained, but it's like it was withheld until the end because it's almost like all these references.
Well, quote unquote explained,
Right, exactly. The explanations are only so much explanation, but because the AUs is the Aragon Union of Sista, which is what, and so the mystery deepens, but there is this way that things are withheld as you go, and and I think it's meant to sort of string you into the actual experience of this encounter and this uncertainty. But back to the question I started with. I mean, do you enjoy reading this?
Oh, definitely. I mean, again, there were parts that frustrated me, albeit in a good way, in that I couldn't figure out things. But once I got past the dial and the first one or two stories after that, I just decided, these stories are supposed to be enigmatic, and I should quit trying to figure out things in such a logical manner. In other words, quit trying to find a kind of cause and effect relationship in terms of the various plot points, and just let the story kind of seep into me, so to speak, or me seep into the story. And that's when things changed for me. That's when I started to appreciate much more what Chris Reynolds is doing in these narratives.
Yeah.
Now, I'm glad with the dial you mentioned the note in the back. I'm like you. I didn't see that until I'd finished the story proper. And then to some degree, it helped to explain things. But still, the notes are based in a fantastical story world that doesn't make sense with their own reality. So that's why I meant it does and doesn't explain things.
Yeah.
But, this is the only piece in this collection with notes. And at the very bottom of that page, there is typed out Mauretania Comics. And I'm wondering, or at least I get the sense, that this is one of the earliest pieces that Reynolds created in his Mauretania world. And this is where I think the academic in me comes out. The one thing I wish this collection did provide is something that you alluded to earlier, is original publication dates. And not only the dates, but also where these pieces originally appeared. I did not see any information of that sort in the Indicia.
Right, yeah. I didn't either. And I wonder if some of that was intentional. I mean, knowing Seth, sorry to come back again to Seth. We're meant to embark on a hunting journey. Like if you really love this stuff, you're going to have to go hunt down the origins of this stuff.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I think that it is such an interesting bit of work. And, actually one of the things I noticed, especially, in the way that this is set up, the dial really sets you up for things. Mauretania, actually, the graphic novel that's at the end, that's, collected at the end of this, is a little bit less frustrating, but maybe that's because you've been set up for it. You've read already, whatever, 150, 200 pages of this stuff, so that when you start in on the story, you're kind of expecting it to be incoherent, but in contrast, it actually does lead sort of one thing to another, even if those things don't necessarily make a ton of sense, But one of the things I really enjoyed about it was actually the way that the short stories line up, because what you find is that they start to feel like variations on a theme. And I can imagine reading a comics anthology and coming across, just reading a bunch of other creators and a bunch of other styles, and then coming across this, one of these short stories and just being like, okay, that was weird. Let me move on. We have those experiences all the time when we're reading anthologies, right? But when you see short story, placed beside short story, juxtaposed with other short story, you kind of start to see that there's like variability. Like sometimes he's really super, mysterious, and non-specific about settings. And then there's one where it's like all of a sudden super, specific. Or, sometimes he's like, it seems weird sci-fi. And then there's the cinema detectives where, okay, we're clearly detectives here, and there's just little shifts that make each of the stories, I think, heighten a certain note of his work, that the collection of them and the contrast between one and another just kind of makes you feel like the work and the range of this work has sort of more corners than you expected. And so I like that collection effect. Yeah.
Another thing about the shorter pieces that make up, after the dial, the first half of this collection, some of the narratives are interconnected in some way or another. And, as you pointed out earlier, if we had to pick one main character throughout most of the stories, he's not in every one, but it would be Monitor. And, this is a character, as you were describing earlier, he wears a helmet and some kind of visor in front of him. And in fact, one of the things that Ed Park mentions is that it looks like a gaming device, right? That he has some kind of helmet, an eyepiece in front of him that allows him to enter almost in a kind of virtual reality way, some kind of game. But he does have that look. He wears a jumper, and we see him as the subject of many of these stories, and some of them do reference what happens in earlier stories. So, for instance, in the, I think, 2-pager, The Black Hills, Monitor is working for a freezer refrigeration company. And then in the next story, The Small Mines, there's a reference to Monitor no longer working at the refrigerator company, but now what he's doing is he's checking out a variety of small mines in another area, in another region. And then so that longer story kind of picks up in many ways from where The Black Hills left off.
Right.
There are also other stories that don't include Monitor, but are nonetheless linked to him in some way. And I'm thinking in particular of the stories with Jimmy and Rosa, his mother. Yeah. Because there are two in particular that deal with Rosa. We see each other. We're introduced to Rosa, and she's a detective.
Mm-hmm.
And she is the mother of Jimmy, and we learn, I think it's in this story, that Jimmy has a fascination with Monitor.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have no idea what the relationship is between Monitor and why he should be a center of attention for Jimmy, but I guess Jimmy just thinks he's cool. And Rosa's husband, Jimmy's father, is a little uncertain about Monitor. There's something about Monitor that puts him off, but Jimmy wants to be like Monitor. And then later on, Jimmy, and it may be in the story, the other Rosa story, Hello, that Jimmy decides to don a helmet and visor like Monitor, except where Monitor's helmet on the sides has an M for Monitor, I'm assuming. What Jimmy does is he puts 2 marks, like the Roman numeral 2, and they ask him, why the 2? He says, well, I'm not the original Monitor. So I guess he's Monitor 2. And in fact, that's the image that we see on the very front of the New World. On the cover. And so the story Hello picks up from where we see each other, leaves off in many ways. Although in the story Hello, we're introduced to Inspector Rockwell, I think it is. And he kind of has a thing for Rosa, and everybody assumes that Rosa is dead, but there's something weird going on. She may not be. So, I mean, and again, one of the kind of dream logic narratives doesn't seem to make sense. Just go with it.
Yeah, exactly. Just go with it. And, in the graphic novel, Mauretania at the end, it's Jimmy with the 2 helmet, and actually reveals himself as Jimmy, who, is not at the center of that story, since I wouldn't say that there's so much a center, but is sort of an object in that story. Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about the longer story at the end, Mauretania.
Yeah, sure.
Now, okay, so you're right in that Jimmy is not the protagonist, but he's an important element, right? I mean, he is, I wouldn't call him a MacGuffin, the thing that kind of enigmatic that moves things forward, but he is in many ways the object that propels the plot.
Yeah.
Because we see at the very beginning, we're introduced to 2 characters, Susan, who's the protagonist here, and then Alf. And both of them work at a business of Alf's called Fern Limited, because Alf's last name is Fern. And when the story opens, Fern Limited is closing down. Susan has to get a job, and just by chance, another business contacts her, and without even an interview, say that they want to hire her.
Right.
And then soon after, they also hire Alf.
Right.
And I'm trying to remember what this business is supposed to be, or what it's a front for.
It's called Raynal Agency.
That's right.
It winds up being
import-export. That's right. That's what they.
Oh, right.
Yeah. But it ends up being, you were going to say?
No, import-export is a perfect cover business, right? Because what exactly are you importing, exporting? But it winds up being something called rational control, which Susan finds out by doing a little bit of snooping, because she's sort of suddenly finds herself with a fresh kind of boldness. And it's one of the many references throughout the text to the title, The New World. She's sort of like, it's a new world, so I'm going to go and do this, And so she basically stays late at work and does a little snooping and finds out that they're investigating these closing businesses, because it seems like there's some kind of association between the closed businesses and this outfit across the street, which turns out to be where Jimmy is, which Susan has spotted him earlier, that across the street from Raynal Agency is a building, a weird empty looking building, like so many of the buildings in this book, and but there's Jimmy with his helmet. And so they start to she starts to become sort of sent as a undercover agent to try to ferret out what the nefarious, plans of Jimmy and his business are. And it leads that I think that's where it leads to weird things, more weird things.
Yeah. And this organization is like a police force, an investigative body. And so, they're wanting to find out what it is about we learn Jimmy and these businesses closing. And one of the things that Susan learns from Jimmy when she actually does meet him and the whole conversations with him, he tells her that he is closing down businesses. How does he put it? That are not good for society, or
they harm. Yeah,
they're harmful. Now, he doesn't define what he means by harmful. In fact, that leaves Susan with a big question mark, right? What does he mean by this? And it's never explained. Again, part of the enigma that's going on here. So we don't, not only do we not know about the relationship between Jimmy and what he's doing and these various businesses, but we don't even know what he means by harmful.
Right. Really, or what he's up to. And, and you know, I don't know how many answers we get, just like so many of these stories. I think the answers are more like existential answers than they are like.
And then at the end of this, a telephone is involved with an extremely long cord that kind of wraps back toward itself. It's strange. Again, dreamlike.
Yeah. But I do think that there is, it's interesting for this book to come out, and I don't want to give away the ending, not as if the ending was some sort of thing that like, I guess there is a logical link in the ending. It's an interesting ending. I thought it was a perfect kind of punch to the Mauretania story and really the whole book. But but without giving it away, it does seem like a fitting thematic tie. And that's the other thing to say, besides the through line of the character, Monitor, Jimmy, and so on, who appear in the short stories and then in Mauretania. I think there is also through line of themes. Again, we've said it before, like houses and dials and certain sort of thematic motifs that sort of resurface again and again in the work and make the world what it is.
Right. And you did mention that the title, The New World, is referenced in the story. Again, I'm not giving anything away here, but on the very last page, the New World is mentioned in the last two panels. Yeah.
And that's exactly the sort of like, bringing it all together feeling that I get from that. Yeah.
There's so much that we could say about the New World, and we've only, in many ways, kind of just scratched the surface. I know we've talked about the Dial, and then Mauretania, and then some of the stories in the middle. Are there any other pieces, let's say, of the short story section that you would like to discuss while we're still on the New World? There's so much to talk about. I feel almost overwhelmed.
Right. As you bring up those various things, I have extensive notes about just tracing all these themes. And then I realize actually what I want to bring up is Our Town, the story that's on page 68. And the story has a similar sense of wandering around in these sort of hollowed out buildings, and in fact, one point, there's a quote where a Monitor says, "A desolate place, you might say." And it ends with Monitor shouting, "You fool, Monitor, you stupid fool." And I have to admit that all the work that I did following some of these things, and, I do have some thoughts about what they're quote unquote about, but I do think that this text is again resisting a simple aboutness, So I do, so chasing some of these wires or these threads, I do feel a certain, "You fool, Monitor, you fool, you stupid fool," trying to overthink it or I think, it's a kind of work, it's the kind of text that you, it repays giving it thought and also, wants to resist, you're sort of, you're wanting to contain it in themes and stuff. So that's my feeling about it.
Yes. You want to move on to the second comic we're going to be looking at for this week?
Yeah, I like the New World, but I also like this, and what a contrast.
Exactly. Both of these are just absolutely compelling texts, first and foremost, but they're doing so radically different things. Yeah. Whereas, as we've been mentioning, the pieces in Reynolds's The New World are mysteries or enigmas or things that don't seem to make sense, much more dreamlike than realistic. Young Frances by Hartley Lin is actually quite realistic in terms of his style.
Yeah, there's a realism in these stories that is, Dan Clowes-esque. Is that fair to say? And I feel like Hartley Lin, who was publishing for, the previous 10 years, this is kind of Lin's debut as Hartley Lin, because most of us who are fans of his work through his sort of periodically published comic Pope Hats knew him as Ethan Rilly, which is an anagram of his name. But for a while, Ethan Rilly fans would look forward to each issue of Pope Hats because it was just a really cool series collection of stuff. And in Pope Hats issues 2, 3, and 5, we would be following the stories of Frances and Vickie, two pals who are the ones that we see on the cover of this book. And so this hardcover collects at last the sort of ongoing story of especially Frances, but also centrally her relationship with her pal Vickie, and just a beautifully drawn, beautifully rendered, wonderfully charming sort of examination of or exploration of Frances's life as a law clerk, and in her sort of 20s, and her experiences, her relationships, her friendships, most significantly with Vickie. So it's a story that I've been following Pope Hats, and I've been a big Pope Hats devotee since discovering issue 3 at AdHouse, and seeing it all put together here in the 150 odd collection makes me even more totally in love with this work, and I love Hartley Lin's. I love Hartley Lin's work.
Right. Now, and you're right. This book is coming out from AdHouse Books. And again, the Amazon release date states that it's May 15th, but I guess it's out in shops already.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Pope Hats as well. Now, I remember on our year-end show, Best of, you had said that I think issue number 5, which came out in September of last year, was it an honorable mention, I think? One of the ones that wasn't in your best 10.
Yeah.
But it was one that you nonetheless wanted to highlight. And it's interesting because I got that when it came out, but I didn't read it, which is weird because I'd read 1 through 4. And so I was familiar with what Rilly, or now Lin, is doing and had been doing with Frances and Vickie. But I didn't get to number 5. But of course, now I have with this collection, Young Frances. Now, we should mention that Young Frances collects Pope Hats number 2, 3, and 5. Now, the reason that it doesn't collect Pope Hats number 4, which came out in June of 2015, is because in issue number 4, we don't have Frances and Vickie. We have a collection of various stories, right, that are good, but it's not Frances and Vickie stories. And I remember that's something that kind of threw me, right, because I wanted to find out what was going to go on with Frances and Vickie. We had them in Pope Hats 1, 2, 3, and then 4 was something completely different. And then 5, we did get back to Frances. I was interested in the fact that Pope Hats number 1 wasn't collected in this book, Young Frances. And I think that and I went back to look at Pope Hats number 1 because it's been a while since I'd read it. And I think maybe 1 or 2 of the reasons why it wasn't included is the art is very different. I mean, you can tell this is a younger piece of work from Hartley Lin than some of the later work. So the way that he draws Frances and Vickie, in many ways radically different from, I would say, a more mature style that we see in issue number 2 of Pope Hats. Another thing is that in Pope Hats number 1, we get 2 short stories about Frances primarily, but also Vickie in that first story. And they really don't play much of a part narrative-wise into what happens with Frances and Vickie in issues number 2, 3, and 5. So it just makes sense that this new book, Young Frances, collects Pope Hats number 2, 3, and 5, and not 4, definitely, but also not issue number 1. Although it would be interesting how the book, Young Frances, would have felt if Lin had decided to include the two short pieces that were a part of Popats #1.
Yeah. And I think now that's left for, again, like we were talking about Seth doing, left for fans who are discovering Lin for the first time to chase down Popats #1 and #4, which I do recommend you doing because I agree with you. The first issue is a little rougher in terms of the art, but not by much. I mean, Lin is an incredible artist. I mean, this is the stuff that just speaks to my heart. It's cartooning, but it's really sophisticated, mature, well-developed cartooning. And, I think to me on a level with your Tomanés and your Klauses and stuff like that.
Right.
And actually I'm reminded of Kevin Huizenga, in some of the styles, and there's, reminiscent of V.T. Hamlin's, sort of Bigfoot cartooning, or you can think of Little Orphan Annie, Harold Gray kind of cartooning, but also, the way of drawing the world is really, just really great cartooning in general. I love this stuff, and I love the sort of, we know how we feel about this term, but the slice of life, or the verite dessinée that we're popularizing here, Derek. That this represents, and so many pieces of this are so appealing to me, and that's what Popats has been. But I do encourage folks, if they read, if this is your first exposure to Lin, which I think, this is really sort of, Lin arriving, right? Sort of being marketed, billed as his first graphic novel. It hopefully will lead you to chase down the other, Popats, issues.
Exactly. Another reason that I think Lin may have decided not to include what we find in issue #1 of Popats in this Young Frances graphic novel is that in that first story, and I was reminded of this when you mentioned verite dessinée, and by the way, thank you, because I really do think, and this is also definitely thanks to Gene who came up with this phrase.
Oh, yeah.
That this is I think this is a good way of describing these kind of stories, right? Slice of life may be a little awkward, and I think kind of vapid in many ways, but drawn truth, verite dessinée, I think, is much more to the point. But in that first story in Popats #1, much of it concerns Frances talking with a ghost.
Yeah.
Now, definitely not realistic in nature. Now, you could say that it's part of her imagination. And as we see throughout Young Frances, I mean, there is a lot of imagination and speculation and at times retreat into thoughts and even dreams that goes on with Frances. But not just in terms of style, but also in terms of storytelling style, I think. The content. That first story in Popats #1, very different from what we see in later issues of Popats. Now, it's interesting. Earlier, you made an association between what Lin does with these Frances stories, Frances and Vickie, and Dan Clowes. It's funny. I didn't even think for a moment about Dan Clowes. Now, Adrian Tomine, it makes sense to me. Although the thing about Tomine is that, with maybe one exception, which became the graphic novel Shortcomings, all of his stories are like done in one, self-contained.
Right.
Whereas what we have here is an ongoing story of primarily Frances, but also her relationship with her friend Vickie and what Vickie does. So to some degree, this strikes me as one way of describing Young Frances is something like what Jaime Hernandez does with Maggie and Hopi, but not near as sustained as we have with Maggie and Hopi. But I was also thinking about other more realistic types of storytellers in comics, or those who engage in, let's say, verite dessinée. Just recently, I had the pleasure of interviewing Pat Palermo about the first issue of his new series, Live Work. Right. And that's another example that I was thinking of. I was also thinking of Alex Robinson in the kind of comics that he does with, let's say, Box Office Poison or Our Expanding Universe. Right. The difference between Palermo and Robinson, though, and then Lin, is that whereas Palermo and Robinson tend to really thrive with ensemble casts, Lin is doing something more akin to, again, Jaime Hernandez, is in focusing in on one or even two individuals and making that the main thread of the ongoing storyline, because that's what we have in Young Frances.
Yeah, I think those are all fair comparisons of, pieces of this creator and that. And, we do all this comparing just to help to, set a context for young Frances. And yet I think, Lin is doing something pretty unique. But I'm definitely with you that there's this concentration on these two characters that do remind me, of course, of Maggie and Hopi. Their friendship, their bond, the way that their dialogue with one another is a way that they make sense of their life experiences. And that, is very reminiscent for me of Maggie and Hopi, the way that they are, both sort of lifelong friends through thick and thin and quite contrasting personalities. So they're like perfect foils for one another. The thing that made me think of Klaus was in particular the quippy dialogue. And I love the sort of, the very, real, but very sort of, it's not mannered. It's actually pretty loose, it's the way that people talk, but it's like a way that people smarter and funnier than us talk, in that realism. On page 16, Vickie is crawling through a window with a boy visitor over
Peter,
Frances.
right?
Is that Peter there?
I think
maybe
it's
Peter.
Yeah.
Okay. And she's saying, we're going to do a sensible amount of shrooms and then hold a roundtable discussion about our values. Just like little drops like that of dialogue that I think reminded me the most of some of Klaus's work. But I do think that there's various elements sprinkled in, that, you might attribute to influences, and yet this confidence in the voice that, to me felt, really mature for a creator who was, for whom this was their early work, and I don't know much about Lin's background except to say that this is, some of the first public stuff that we're seeing with him. And even though it came out in these different issues, as you were saying, it feels, coherent, doesn't it? Doesn't it feel like from start to finish, like it holds together super well as a graphic novel? Oh,
most certainly. And, I'm glad that you pointed out that in no way whatsoever are we suggesting that Lin's work in Young Frances is derivative, right? That what we see in Pope Hats is something that is very much like Jaime Hernandez or Daniel Klaus or Adrian Tomini or others. But we're using these comparisons as, I guess, ways for listeners to grab onto. For instance, if they're not familiar with Pope Hats, if they've never picked up an issue and they haven't gotten this new book, Young Frances, then I think describing the storytelling style, not so much the art, but the storytelling style, as something more realistic in the vein of so-and-so or so-and-so, helps you to wrap your brain around it, at least initially. But I'm with you. I do think that this is unique storytelling, and the way that Lin deals with dialogue especially, I think, is a standout. And you're right. Some of the things that the characters say and even think are realistic in nature and sometimes a little more clever than I could come up with. But it does strike me as true to life. Yeah. And not just the dialogue, but the situations that Frances, maybe to a lesser degree Vickie, but definitely Frances, find themselves in. Yeah. And we can, hopefully we're attracting readers here as we describe it. Again, I'm effusive about this book. I really love it. But Frances, as we mentioned before, is a law clerk, and so much of the story is about the rat race that is, working at a law firm, and how intense people are, and some of the really larger than life characters that are there. She winds up in many cases answering to and being advocated for by a Marcel Castonguay, who's this Bigfoot cartooning, lawyer, right? Who's just so really thick character and big hands and a character. Yes, huge hands. But very much a character. As much a character as say your Roger Sterling's from Mad Men and stuff like that, in terms of being a big presence at a firm. And then Vickie, meanwhile, and Vickie has this sort of slacker affect, although she does, become really hardworking and ambitious about certain things. Vickie is an actress and pursues sort of her dream to get roles, get parts as an actress. And, both of them
are sort of making it, they're doing well in the world, but there's a lot to cope with along the way. Frances can't sleep. Vickie has a partying life and a love life and all that kind of stuff to juggle and to manage. And, they connect via cell phone even when they're across the country from each other. So just watching these relationships unfold, watching the exploration of, the competitive life at a law firm, and the other characters around Frances and how Frances tries to manage all these different relationships and expectations, watching Vickie's career, watching Peter, who is the kind of the love interest, if that's fair to say. Yeah, it just unfolds, really, well paced and interesting and absorbing. It's a great 150 page kind of, piece of a life,
Yeah, and I just wish that we had more story because I want more of Frances and Vickie.
Yeah.
Now, as you pointed out, much of the story in Young Frances is about this relationship between Frances and her friend Vickie. Although we see things much more through Frances's eyes, she becomes the focalizer.
Sure.
So I think it's safe to call her the protagonist, and I wouldn't call Vickie a side character. I mean, she's an important figure, but again, since we are experiencing things primarily through the eyes of Frances, this is her story. And you mentioned her working at this law firm as a clerk, and it does seem to be, an experience where she does a lot of the grunt work. She works for, again, this larger than life lawyer, Castangui, and he becomes her champion. And as the story progresses, he has, without giving anything away, big plans for her. And so one of the dilemmas that she has to confront is whether she wants to take him up, Castangui, on his offer to give her more responsibility and what that might mean.
Yeah.
So there are big matters like this. But to me, one of the things that really drives Young Frances is the minutia of her life, and not just at work, but also when she's not at work. Although I think most of it takes place in the office, but it's the competitive nature of the game, the gossip, the relationship, the way that people see her, and to in the office, and to some degree that kind of changes toward the end of the book. But even then, I mean, the way that people view her, both Vickie and also her coworkers, seems pretty consistent. In other words, I think that it would be accurate to define Frances by the way that other people say that they see her, the various compliments that they give her. And that's the kind of person that she is. Now, again, seeing things unfold primarily through Frances's eyes, we can see that she has her own doubts and she doesn't feel that she measures up to the way that other people see her.
Oh, yeah.
However, at least I, as a reader, do feel that the way that the other people see her seem to be fairly reliable. In other words, there's something quite drawing and alluring to the character Frances to where we can empathize with her. And even though we may not want to do the kind of things that she does, I found myself wanting to be the kind of good person that she appears to be.
Yeah. And everybody sort of comments, this is why you're making it here, because, you don't judge, things like that. And she does become the kind of character, and she takes on this role in the office, which is part of her success, of sort of handling the emotions and the outbursts and the sort of, grief of all of the people around her, including, and this is where she becomes a sort of a reflecting pool for all of those tensions and anxieties in that kind of a hypercharged workplace. I bought a copy of this book to give to my best friend who's a lawyer, no longer practicing at a firm, but this is exactly how he describes things. Everybody's obsessed over their billable hours and people are being set up. Sometimes, there's one character, Nina, who's set up to essentially fail and take the fall, in a really tough situation in a courtroom scene and things like that. And so she's got to absorb and observe all of these these things around her, and she becomes that kind of character. And what you see is the other end of that life. Everybody knows somebody like that in a workplace or in an office, somebody who's like uber competent and even tempered, and then, winds up being the place where I'm freaking out. I need someone to freak out, with or at, and what you see is the other end of that and what she brings home. And, she winds up having trouble sleeping, and that's like a big theme in the beginning part of it. And so,
her insomnia,
absolutely. Yeah. So she is a, hyper appealing character. And because I think there's an intimacy in that we get to see how others see her and rely on her. And then we get to see all these little moments of, losing her control a little bit, napping at a meeting, or there's one moment where there's a party, and everybody, it's Vickie's pals, and they're all sort of in the, Vickie's lifestyle kind of way, partying it up, and Frances starts looking around and being super judgy, and she's sort of the high-powered law clerk with Vickie's, wastrel friends, and you hear her catching herself like, oh man, I'm not in the right mood for this, and so those little moments of vulnerability, I think, also make her all the more appealing.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, earlier you mentioned her success. It's an inadvertent success, right? Because one of the things that I think endears her to not just her coworkers, but everyone around her, is she's someone, I don't want to say devoid of ambition, but she definitely doesn't pursue it at the expense of other things or almost everything else. So the way that Castagnier feels about her and what he has plans for in terms of her role in the office is something that seems to come out of the blue for her, because she hadn't even imagined that in any way. And again, we don't want to give anything away about where she may or may not end up in terms of her responsibilities at the office.
Right.
Another thing worth mentioning is, you pointed out that her friend Vickie, in the first part of the book, they're living together, but then Vickie moves to, I guess, Hollywood because she gets a role on a TV show, a leading role. And interestingly enough, the TV show is called Bad Prosecutor.
That's right.
And it's kind of I guess kind of a cheesy adventure law-based crime show, and Vickie plays the lead role. And so here we have this connection between the two, curiously enough, in the law. And as Frances points out at one point, once the show goes on the air, there are people in the law office who like it and are talking about it because it does deal with the law. And unbeknownst to them, Frances is friends with the lead actor.
Right. Yeah, the poster for the show, the billboard that we see at one point says, "Brilliant, beautiful. She'll literally tear your heart out." That's Bad Prosecutor.
And it comes on Thursdays at 9 p.m.
That's right. In case you don't want to miss it. DVR that show. But I think that, yeah, exactly. It's such a fun contrast of that, of Vickie's personality being so different from Frances's. And meanwhile, she is, playing this role that is supposed to be some version of, either Frances or the people around Frances. And, it is a funny juxtaposition there.
Again, bringing in this relationship between Frances and Vickie, to some degree, I would argue that the way that Lin deals with these characters throughout the text, right, that originally appeared as Popats 2, 3, and 5, it seems to me, at least on the surface, that Vickie grows more as a character than Frances does, to some degree. Because, as you pointed out, at the very beginning, we see Vickie when, she and Frances are living together. And, Vickie's an actress or an actor wannabe, but she has this kind of non-serious party life that would, at least on the surface, appear to undermine her attempts, right? Because she'd stay out partying, she wouldn't get the jobs. But by chance, she lands this gig on Bad Prosecutor. And it's once she goes out to the West Coast to begin that role that she seems to grow as a character. In other words, she seems to mature. As you mentioned, because she quits partying and she also becomes much more attuned to others around her. And what I mean by that is there's one point toward the end of this book where Vickie says to Frances, I know some people here, some of the showrunners, who are fascinated by the fact that you work as a clerk in a big law firm. Why don't you come out here and you would work with these writers? You'd be a consultant. You could make good money. It would be something different. And so, I mean, not only is this a tempting opportunity for Frances, and we won't say one way or another whether she takes that or not, but Vickie is looking out for her friend in a way that she wasn't toward the beginning of the book, right? So in that way, she matures and becomes more empathic to other people's plights. On the other hand, I do think that Frances does grow. I think through, at least my sense of this book, is that her character seems somewhat consistent throughout. In other words, the Frances that we see in the opening pages is more or less the Frances we see in the middle and the Frances that we see toward the end. However, given certain decisions that she makes at the end of this narrative, and again, we don't want to give anything away, I think that's where we see some noticeable changes in the character Frances through her decisions. Now, the book ends at such a place where we don't know what the consequences of those decisions are going to be. And it's not just work related, right? Because there's something else that happens at the very end that has me wondering, where's this going to lead? So I can't wait for the next Pope Hats, if indeed Lin is going to continue the serialization of Pope Hats, or if he's just going to work in graphic novel form from here on in.
Right. Which, to pick up from your last thread, I would be on board for either. Yeah. I'd love periodic Hartley Lin, and I'd also, be really great. It'd be really great to see more of this kind of graphic novel work. And I think there's going to be clamor for it because, as I said earlier in the episode, it's already sold out, the first printing of Young Frances. And I think this book is really going to take off. But to come back to some of the themes, and I agree with you, I think Vickie grows and it's really satisfying to watch. I think Frances grows too. And for me, the way that she grows is a little different and harder to detect. But there's a theme that's laced throughout. The very opening scene, she's getting ready for the day. And that's sort of mundane, get ready for the day. That's a picture of her life. But then she goes jogging. And while she's jogging, she sees this bird in a tree, and everybody's kind of staring at it. And she says she's noticed the bird before. And later on in the I don't know, some number of pages in, she sees the bird again and she says, "You're still here." And there's all these places. There's one point she's in a subway and somebody's reading maybe a self-help book. And, one of the little bits of self-help quotes is, "Success is the sum of small efforts repeated day in and day out." And then there's another point where Vickie is performing in a play and she says, one of her lines is about the strength to endure. And I think what we see around her is this crushing throng of expectations. Speaking of the bird, there's one point where it's like a one-page mysterious incident that almost doesn't get remarked on much, but basically a piece of the building falls off the side.
Yeah, that's weird.
The law firm's, big, high-rise corporate building, whatever it's called, just a chunk of it just falls off, and they just explain,
marble,
that's right. Somebody explains, sometimes this happens with marble, but then it it descends like many, many stories and crushes a bird on the sidewalk, and it might be a bit literally heavy-handed, but I think it's really just this way that this world seems really tightly held together with marble, but really, underneath it's all sort of at risk of falling apart, in some way and crushing those beneath it. And so the question that I think the tension underlying all of this is Frances going to get crushed, by the expectations, by the pressures, by the rhythms of her work? And so just enduring is itself, to me, I think is itself a victory. And I think that's a victory that, I won't give away what happens at the end, but that is the sort of crucial question that we're following along with Frances about.
Those are really good points. And I have to tell you, I didn't even think about the bird imagery that is woven throughout much of this narrative. But you're right. It does begin with a bird. The marble does crush the bird. And there is this theme, definitely with Frances, of endurance.
Yeah.
And which I think makes what happens at the end and the decisions that she makes, again, which we're not going to give away, even more compelling, right? Because up until this point, she seems to be someone who endures by doing what she just normally does, what comes natural to her. Kind of, again, inadvertent success.
Yeah.
But when she does make certain decisions, finally, what are the consequences of those going to be? And I guess those will be in subsequent Frances and Vickie stories.
Yeah. I hope we really do get to see that, because I do think there's some ambivalence about. I mean, the art has some ambivalence about that. The end of one of the short stories, Castonguay is running on a treadmill, and the last line is, "Today I'm crap, but tomorrow I'll be good." Mm-hmm. And I think that ethic is both held up and also put into question. Like they're just like, keep pushing on, keep pushing on, keep pushing on. Is that actually a good thing for us? I don't know. And I think the text is also, ambivalent about that too.
I'm glad you mentioned that scene, because this is just one of many examples of Lin's art in Young Frances where we have one character either thinking or saying something, but it appears in a panel where we have another character doing something. And so I love the
voiceover,
way,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. I love the way that Lin kind of blends his storylines or his characters' lives together in this way. I think it's quite effective, and it shows kind of a connectedness, right? Now, earlier I pointed out a difference between, let's say, what Lin's doing in Young Frances and what Pat Palermo and Alex Robinson do with their ensemble cast. I wouldn't say that Young Frances thrives with an ensemble cast, but there are a good number of characters, major and minor, that are interlinked. And one way that Lin does this is through these various dialogues.
Yeah. Yep.
And monologues.
I love that. Yes. Yeah. The voice over, for instance, in the scene where, I don't want to give up too much away, but there's a scene that concerns somebody's employment where the voiceover is really poignant, actually, selections like that. Yeah, just really good, artful storytelling in this book. So I love this.
Okay, the final title that Paul and I are discussing for this week is A Walk Through Hell, #1. This comes out from Aftershock. In fact, the release is the day that this episode is going to be going up, May 16th. And it's written by Garth Ennis and illustrated by Goran Sudzuka. And I guess I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Goran Sudzuka?
Could be. I admit knowing less than you.
Yeah. I don't recall seeing any of Sudzuka's work in the past, although I love this artwork. But Garth Ennis, of course, I'm familiar with.
Sure. Garth Ennis we know well. And Garth Ennis, this is the first time in a bit that Garth Ennis has done horror. Of course, we know Crossed and things like that. But this is Ennis sort of returning to horror, although in a very timely, current way, which I'm sure we'll get to. Sudzuka I did know because he was maybe the main fill-in artist for Brian Azzarello and Cliff Chiang's run on Wonder Woman during the New 52 era of DC.
Okay.
And I just know that because Cliff Chiang is a hard act to follow as an artist. But Sudzuka, followed it pretty well. I think was more than just a fill-in. I think he sort of held his own. And this art is really good and reminiscent of that, but also unique.
See, I didn't know that because I didn't read that series, but now that you say that, I can look at Sudzuka's art and I do see a Chiangness to it. To some degree.
Changianity to
it. We're making up new words here.
That's right.
But we're both students of language, and so why not?
That's what we do. Coinage.
Okay, so again, this comes out from Aftershock. This is the first Aftershock title that we've discussed in a while. On past podcasts, we have looked at various Aftershock series. We even had an Aftershock publisher spotlight when they first started a few years ago. But it's been a while maybe a year since we last looked at an Aftershock title. But we saw this. I mean, first and foremost, I saw the name Garth Ennis and I thought, okay, interesting. This is, this is a horror narrative. And so that kind of drew me in even more. We're looking at this from a PDF, a review PDF that we received. And the story is approximately 22 pages long, so it's, I guess, about the average length of a comic. I maybe pulling back. I don't know if this is the best place to start, but if I pull back and look at this first issue as a whole, I'm drawn to it. I want to read more, but I had a feeling after reading this first issue of A Walk Through Hell, similar to other experiences I've had with Aftershock titles, and that is the first issue is interesting, but I thought there should have been a little more. And I remember feeling that way with Animosity. I read the first issue of Animosity, and I liked it a lot better than Intersects. I thought it was more cohesive. At the same time, I remember being disappointed where it left off, thinking, shouldn't there be more? And I'm not necessarily asking the good folks at Aftershock to do what many creators at Image do, right? With the first issue, give us a real substantive issue in terms of page length. It's not so much that I'm asking this, but I do think that with this first issue of A Walk Through Hell, there are so many balls in the air that Innes is juggling in so many mysteries that I wanted a little more. Although, I'm going to go on to read the next issue because I want some of these mysteries to be solved. But there's a lot going on here, and I felt, especially at first, the first time I read this, a little confused, especially with the opening pages. And I think that's just the way that it's presented, and it's supposed to be, I guess, this way. So it's not a function of poor writing or art or anything like that. It's just me in how I'm approaching the opening pages of this first issue. But there are a lot of questions that we're left with at the end of issue 1.
Yeah. I sympathize with your feeling that it's really it does feel quite brief, although it didn't, to me, lack substance. And I'd say, I guess I feel differently about it in that maybe it's my own expectations of having tried a bunch of Aftershock #1s where it does feel much more like a teaser. You're right. There's like, it's like we've barely gotten our head around it. And there's a lot of sort of like exciting and sudden and very gripping things that go on in this first issue. And then it does feel like all too soon we're left to wait until issue 2. And I agree with you. That's really how a lot of these Aftershock #1s feel. And, I know that issue 2 will only give us a tiny bit more of the puzzle, and that's to be expected. But, do you know how long this series is expected to run? Did they announce yet already the length of the series?
I don't remember seeing it, but maybe it was stated in the previews and I'm just not remembering.
I'm not sure either.
Now, I don't want to suggest that there's not much substance to this first issue. I do think it's substantive. It's just that there are a lot of questions that are raised that are never answered. And not that I'm expecting questions to be answered in the first issue, of course, because that's what compels us to pick up the second and third issues. So on and so forth.
That's right.
But again, with my experience with Aftershock, and apparently yours as well, sometimes these first issues appear more as teasers.
Yeah, but it's a great tease. I mean, Ennis knows the right strings to pull. And I'll start off by saying that when you pitched to me this text and I saw that it was a horror comic, I had to get over some resistances of mine. And I'm glad that I did because I think it's a super compelling text. Now, I got to admit, I'm not sure that I'll go on with it. I might out of morbid curiosity.
Because you're not a big horror fan, are you?
I'm not a big horror fan, but I got to say that since thinking a lot about Get Out last year, the movie Get Out, Jordan Peele's, is it Jordan Peele? Yeah. Jordan Peele's movie Get Out last year. I've been thinking a lot about the devices that horror has and how how those devices can be like incredibly powerfully used as social commentary. And that's made me interested in certain kinds of horror, not the more exploitative kind. Well, I guess sometimes it could be still building on the exploitation, genres of work, but the kind that really exploit those aspects of the genre to really say something social political. And I think that is indeed very much happening in this text. The sort of circumference of the plot is basically that there's an incident that happens at the beginning that's a shooting, and there's all kind of commentary about guns and the sort of social media back and forth that we've now come to expect when there's a kind of public, mass shooting situation. And it seems like an airport, is that where this, or a shopping mall,
it's I think, shopping
where
mall, yeah.
Yeah, this one happens, and it's quite shocking and quite troubling to read. But then from there, this voiceover carries us into the two main characters and narrators, it seems, a pair of detectives who are pursuing a certain strange case that takes them to a mysterious warehouse. And that's kind of the contours of issue 1. But I think that along the way, there's like some chatter, as I mentioned, that social media discourse about guns. And then there's the detective sort of talking about the Trump administration, all that kind of stuff.
Without mentioning Trump. Yeah,
that's right. That's true. But clearly, patently, the administration and, the normalizing of it or not normalizing of it. And to me, that's buzzing there because we're meant to, we're meant to connect some of the horrors that some of us are witnessing and feeling about things going on politically with some of the horror that's set up in the big gaping mystery that's at the center of this, which has to do with this warehouse that they wind up at and what happens when people enter that warehouse. So, so it's effective. It's effective horror for me is what I was trying to say.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the opening scene. And again, this is, I don't think this is giving anything away because it's the opening pages
right at the beginning
when you have this murder. And basically we have, I guess, his husband and wife, and the woman has a baby in a carrier in front of her, one of these, what do you call it?
Baby Bjorn or
like slings, I guess.
Yeah.
And
Baby Bjorn is a brand of one of those things, but
okay,
it's
been a while since I've worn one of those.
Sure,
sure. Been a while. But I used to. But no, they're at a shopping mall, and this guy just breaks out a gun and starts shooting, and he shoots the wife. Now the wife, she's described as a person of color. I mean, she seems to be Asian, at least from the way that Suzuka is drawing her. So then you mentioned some of this social media chatter, and then the conversation that our protagonists, Gregor and Shaw, have with a couple of other detectives. They discuss issues of ethnicity, race, and white rage. And so, again, this is yet another facet of the current times that we're living in now, right? The other, the immigrant, and white America, and taking back or making things great again, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. So,
right.
Let's go back to a time of racism and polio, because that's when America really was America. But, it is very timely. And we've been describing this for the most part as a horror narrative. After I wondered about this before I read this first issue from the solicit, I think I started to wonder, is this going to be really a mystery or a horror narrative? But then after reading this first issue, I see it just as much a crime story or a detective story, if you want to look at it that way, as horror, at least from what I see in this first issue. So it's not just horror. I mean, there is the crime/detective element that's going on here. And of course, by far, this is not the only example where we have a kind of detective fiction or crime fiction mixed with horror in comics. But I do like that mix. See, unlike you, I really love good horror comics. So I'm drawn to this, but I also like even more crime or detective narratives. And so that's one of the things that I think initially drew me in, that in the name Garth Ennis. But we have as our protagonists, apparently, McGregor and Shaw, and they're detectives who are partners. We're introduced to McGregor's voice at the very beginning, because when we see the opening of this couple with a baby at a mall at the with the shooting, we see them, but we also get at the same time that they're doing their thing, we get a voiceover in good detective narrative fashion from McGregor, apparently. And then we see McGregor on his way to work, and this is, he's looking at his phone and he's checking what seems to be Twitter, and this is the social media part. I mentioned that this first issue raises a lot of questions and a number of mysteries. This is where one of those first and most compelling mysteries come from, because after that first scene at the mall, the initial scene at the mall, then we get McGregor and Shaw getting up, going to work, and whereas McGregor is checking social media, getting to his car, driving to work, we see his partner Shaw in bed, and apparently she's having some kind of bad dream, because she's writhing in bed, And in various panels, she's saying, don't, no, don't. We have no clue whatsoever what she's dreaming and what she's going through.
Sure.
And I think that's one of those mysteries that will eventually be addressed later on. So, and we see these panels, these long vertical panels or horizontal panels with her, interspersed with panels of her partner, McGregor, checking social media, Twitter apparently, and on his way to work. And so it goes back and forth. And so we see that even though they're partners, they're going through some different things right now.
Sure.
And we don't know what those things are, especially with Shaw.
Yeah, that's a great use of contrasting parallel, narrative pieces, right? And to me, it seems like really effective use of horror tropes that kind of give a sense of mystery. We follow the characters eventually, and I don't think this gives too much away too, because it's right there on the cover, but we follow them into this gaping maw of a warehouse door, and inside which we don't know, but something horrible is going on. I assume that's the walk through hell. But I think that the idea is not just that there's something inside that's terrible and horrible and mysterious, but that the inside, that going into that warehouse is going to reveal something that is within them or in their history or in their past. And so, our characters are haunted both by the noise and buzz of the world around them in reaction to this horrific shooting, and also by something haunting them in their dreams. And so it just seems like that's all being brought into play. And I feel like effective horror, both externalizes and internalizes what, the monsters. And I think that's going on here too. So. Right.
And so I couldn't help but think that whatever it is that Shaw may be dreaming has something to do in some way, even tangential, with the big horror that is within this warehouse. And the whole warehouse thing is fascinating. And again, we don't want to give too much away, but what draws Shaw and McGregor there is that the two detectives that they're talking with earlier in this first issue, Goss and Hunziker, are going to go to a warehouse to check something out. And right before Goss and Hunziker go into the warehouse, I think one of them calls McGregor. But then McGregor tries to follow up later, but there's no answer. And then later on, their call to the warehouse because something strange has gone on, and we have uniformed officers there. They haven't gone in to check things out, or at least a couple of them haven't, because other officers, I guess a SWAT team, had gone in to this warehouse, but then almost immediately came back out, and they were affected in some way. And the beat cops that the detectives Shaw and McGregor are talking to have no clue whatsoever what happened to them, but they're freaked out. Because if you have the SWAT team that immediately retreats, then what does that say?
Something really big.
And then there are things that transpire at the very end of this first issue that we don't want to give away, specifically with the SWAT team. But by this point, Shaw and McGregor have already entered the warehouse. And it ends with, something's going to happen. You just don't know what.
You don't know what, and something surely horrific. But I think so all that horror, I kept, this is where I was like, I don't know if I'm going to keep going with it, because I'm really curious, of course, to know what is in the warehouse and what the sort of, backstory of this scary thing is. I also got a sense, soon after I read this, I was reading a Washington Post, like a long form piece about Trump voters, maybe the disaffection of some Trump voters in the sort of like Illinois, area, these former steel towns and stuff like that. And just the image of hollowed out factories and warehouses and stuff like that. I just wonder if what will be horrible will be actually very much something that is tied to something political. Actually, I'm reminded of your recent discussion about the Image series Infidel, which also used horror tropes to explore, political issues. And I feel like this will be a horror that is not just scary, but also, of our times. So I'm sort of curious about that, but I also don't like being scared. So,
It makes a lot of sense because, as you pointed out early in this first issue, when McGregor and Shaw are talking with the other detectives, Goss and Hunziker, politics does come up. And even though, again, the name Trump is not mentioned, what Ennis is referring to in terms of this dialogue. And it would be great if it became more linked to the current political moment in terms of the horror, because I don't know, sometimes when I see things that have transpired on the news with this administration, I do feel like saying the horror. The horror.
Does it feel like a walk through hell?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Not personally, but
sure.
I guess watching the news, it does seem hell-like at times. So you may or may not read on through this series of Walk Through Hell. You just don't want to be scared.
How about this? Readers, listeners, let me know. All right. If you are following this series down the line and it turns out to be as intriguing as it seems to be, then I'll read it if you do. I'll go in the warehouse if you do.
So 3 interesting, compelling, and very different titles that we discussed this week. We started off with Chris Reynolds' The New World, comics from Mauretania, and this was published by New York Review Comics. After that, we looked at Young Frances by Hartley Lin, who used to be known as Ethan Rilly, coming out from AdHouse Books. And then the first issue of Garth Ennis and Goran Sudzuka's A Walk Through Hell, coming to us from Aftershock. Great stuff.
Yeah, I really enjoyed these comics and really enjoyed talking to you about them, Derek.
Yes. And, I think that if you want to find great comics like this, the best place to do so, hands down, is at the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. So go to dcbservice.com. You're going to find titles like this and a slew of others at incredible discounts. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this week's discussion. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. The phone number is 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can email us. We're at 2guys@comicsalternative.com or individually at Derek@comicsalternative.com and Paul at comicsalternative.com. Emails are great. We also love when you contact us like Don did on our various social media channels.
That's right. And we have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is, again, comicsalternative.com.
That's right.
Yeah. And do get in touch with us. And if you want to comment like Don does on our preview shows, we'd like to hear that. Or if you want to tell Paul that he should go into the warehouse and continue reading A Walk Through Hell, then that would be appreciated as well.
That's right. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to get your feedback. And as Castonguay says, our work is our very essence.
That's right. And we will share more of our essence next week. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Paul. Take care, everybody.
Hey, what happened?